The mountain was burning, and everyone had given up on the boy. Everyone except the woman they'd mocked 3 weeks earlier. Evelyn Hart stood at the ravine's edge, staring into smoke thick enough to choke on, and made a choice that would either kill her or change everything. Below, 6-year-old Noah Ryder was trapped between boulders while wildfire ate through the ridge above him. Behind her, voices screamed for her to stop. She didn't listen. She never did. But before we get to the fire that proved who she really was, you need to understand how a plus-sized woman from Philadelphia became the most feared person in Montana territory. Hit that like button, drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels, and let me tell you about the summer that broke Black Ridge wide open. The stagecoach hit another rut, and Evelyn Hart's head cracked against the wooden frame hard enough to see stars. She'd stopped apologizing to the other passengers hours ago. The thin man in the corner hadn't spoken since Nebraska. The older woman with the severe bun had made it clear she considered Evelyn's size a personal inconvenience. And the cowboy who'd climbed aboard in Wyoming kept staring at her like she was a curiosity in a traveling show. She was used to it. Outside the window, Montana territory stretched out in shades of brown and yellow, nothing like the green hills she'd left behind in Pennsylvania. The landscape looked mean, unforgiving, like it was daring her to step off the coach and see how long she'd last. Evelyn pressed a hand against the worn leather satchel on her lap. Inside were 3 letters from Caleb Ryder, each one shorter than the last. The first had been almost apologetic, seeking a woman of practical nature for household management and care of 3 children, ages 6 to 15. Ranch life. Hard work. Honest arrangement. The second had simply listed what she'd need to bring. The third confirmed her arrival date and nothing else. She'd answered the advertisement 6 weeks after her brother Thomas died. 6 weeks after the bank took the print shop. 6 weeks after Philadelphia made it clear there was nothing left for a 34-year-old unmarried woman whose family business had been gutted by men in expensive suits. Thomas had fought them. He'd hired lawyers, filed complaints, stood in front of judges, and explained how the contracts had been altered, how the payments had been redirected, how someone named Vernon Mercer had orchestrated the whole thing from behind a web of shell companies and forged documents. Nobody had listened. Thomas died of a heart attack on the courthouse steps, his briefcase still clutched in his hand. Evelyn had found him there, papers scattered across the marble like snow. 3 weeks later, she'd packed everything she owned into 2 trunks and bought a ticket west. The stagecoach lurched again, slower this time. Through the dust-caked window, Evelyn saw buildings, or what passed for buildings out here. Black Ridge wasn't a town so much as a collection of structures huddled together against the wilderness, like they were afraid to spread out too far. "This is it?" the severe woman said, her first words in 200 miles. The driver's voice carried from above. "Black Ridge, folks. End of the line." Evelyn's stomach tightened. She'd been preparing for this moment since Wyoming, rehearsing what she'd say, how she'd stand, what expression she'd wear. Confident but not arrogant. Capable but not threatening. The kind of woman a struggling rancher might actually want as a wife. The coach stopped. Dust settled. Someone outside shouted something she couldn't make out. The cowboy opened the door first, jumping down with easy grace. The severe woman followed, accepting help from the driver without looking at him. The thin man climbed out silently and disappeared into the crowd gathering on the street. Evelyn took a breath, then another. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her skirt and stood, hunching slightly to fit through the narrow doorway. The steps down were steep, designed for people smaller and more agile than she was. She grabbed the frame and lowered herself carefully. The laughter started before her second foot touched the ground. It wasn't loud. Not at first. Just a ripple of amusement from somewhere in the crowd, spreading like fire through dry grass. By the time Evelyn turned around, at least a dozen people were staring at her, and most of them weren't even trying to hide their smirks. A man in a dirty apron elbowed his companion. "That's her?" "No way Caleb's that desperate," someone else muttered. A woman in a faded blue dress shook her head slowly, like she was witnessing a tragedy. "Poor man. He's really scraping the bottom now." Evelyn's face burned. She wanted to climb back into the coach. She wanted to demand the driver take her anywhere else. She wanted to scream at all of them that she'd traveled 1,500 miles and buried her only family and lost everything she'd ever known, and the least they could do was wait until she'd been here 5 minutes before deciding she was worthless. Instead, she lifted her chin and looked directly at the man in the apron. I'm looking for Caleb Ryder. More laughter. A boy no older than 12 made an exaggerated gesture at his friend, miming someone too wide to fit through a door. Ryder's ranch is 8 miles northwest, the stagecoach driver said quietly, pulling down her trunks. He wasn't laughing. That was something. You'll need a wagon. I can arrange. Already arranged? The voice came from behind her, low and rough, like gravel underfoot. Evelyn turned and saw a man standing at the edge of the crowd, holding the reins of a weathered wagon hitched to 2 tired-looking horses. Caleb Ryder didn't look like his letters. She'd imagined someone older, maybe softer. The man in front of her looked like he'd been carved out of the same hard rock as the mountains behind him. Tall, lean, sun-scorched face, eyes that didn't blink often enough. He wore a hat that had seen better years and a shirt that had seen better decades. He looked at her the way you'd look at a horse you weren't sure would make it through winter. "Evelyn Hart?" he said. "Yes." He nodded once. "Let's go." Not welcome to Montana or glad you made it safely or even nice to meet you. Just let's go, like she was a shipment he'd ordered and now needed to haul home before dark. The driver loaded her trunks into the wagon bed. Caleb didn't help. He stood beside the horses, waiting with the kind of patience that felt more like resignation than courtesy. Evelyn climbed into the wagon seat, which was harder than getting out of the stagecoach because there was no step, and Caleb didn't offer assistance. She had to grip the side and haul herself up while her skirts fought her every inch of the way. Behind her, someone said something she couldn't quite hear, followed by more laughter. Caleb swung up beside her and snapped the reins without a word. They rolled out of Black Ridge in silence. The ride was long and uncomfortable. The wagon seat was narrow, forcing them closer together than Evelyn would have liked. Caleb smelled like leather and sweat and something else. Wood smoke, maybe? Or just the general scent of a man who worked outdoors 14 hours a day. He didn't speak. Not when they passed a burned-out homestead with a caved-in roof. Not when they forded a shallow creek and water splashed up over the wheel. Not when they climbed a long ridge and the landscape opened up into something almost beautiful. Rolling hills, scattered cattle, mountains in the distance like broken teeth against the sky. Evelyn counted the minutes. 30, 40, 50. Finally, she broke. "How old are your children?" 15, 12, 6. "Their names?" "Wyatt, Clara, Noah. And your wife? She passed 2 years ago?" "Year and a half." Like pulling teeth. Evelyn tried a different angle. "What happened to your last housekeeper?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "Quit." "Why?" "Wyatt. Your son." "Yeah." "What did he do?" Caleb finally looked at her, and his expression was somewhere between exhausted and irritated. "You ask a lot of questions. I'd like to know what I'm walking into." "Too late for that," he said. "You're already here." The ranch appeared around the next bend, a collection of buildings that looked like they were held together by stubbornness and rust. The main house was 2 stories, weathered gray wood, porch sagging on one side. There was a barn that leaned slightly left, a chicken coop with half its wire torn away, and several smaller structures Evelyn couldn't identify. Cattle dotted the hills beyond, but not many. Definitely not enough for a working ranch this size. Caleb stopped the wagon in front of the house and climbed down. This time he did offer his hand, though it felt more like obligation than kindness. Evelyn took it and stepped down into the dirt. The front door opened and 3 children stepped out onto the porch. The oldest was a boy, tall and lean like his father, with the same hard eyes and the same expression that said he'd already decided she wasn't worth his time. Wyatt. Had to be. The middle child was a girl, maybe 12, with tangled brown hair and a dress that was too short and patched in 6 places. She stared at Evelyn with open curiosity, then glanced at her father like she was waiting for permission to speak. The youngest was a tiny boy with dirt on his face and a wooden horse clutched in one hand. He stayed behind his sister, peeking around her shoulder. "This is Evelyn Hart," Caleb said flatly. "She'll be managing the house. Not this is your new mother, or she's here to help us, or even try to be polite. Just a statement of fact, delivered in the same tone he'd used to describe a broken fence. Wyatt looked her up and down, slowly, making sure she saw him doing it. "She gonna fit through the doorway?" Clara's eyes went wide. The little boy, Noah, made a sound that might have been a giggle. Caleb didn't react. He grabbed one of Evelyn's trunks from the wagon and carried it toward the house, brushing past his children without a word. Evelyn stood there, staring at three faces that ranged from hostile to uncertain to barely interested, and thought about the letters Caleb had sent. Hard work. Honest arrangement. He'd left out the part where his son was cruel and his household was falling apart, and nobody here actually wanted her. But then, she'd expected that. She picked up her smaller bag and walked toward the porch. Wyatt didn't move. She had to angle past him, and he made sure she knew it was difficult. Inside, the house was worse than she'd imagined. The front room looked like a tornado had passed through on its way to somewhere more important. Dishes piled on the table, mud tracked across the floor, a shirt draped over a chair, books stacked in a corner beside a saddle that absolutely did not belong indoors. The air smelled stale, like the windows hadn't been opened in weeks. Through the doorway to the kitchen, Evelyn could see more chaos. Pots on the stove, food scraps on the counter, something dark and sticky on the floor near the pump. Caleb dropped her trunk at the base of the stairs. "Your room's upstairs, second door." "Where do the children sleep?" "Wyatt's in the loft above the barn. Girls share the room at the end of the hall. Noah's in the small room beside it." "Not near me," Evelyn noticed. The children were scattered across the property like Caleb couldn't stand to have them too close. "I'll need to see the kitchen," she said. "Why?" "Because I need to know what I'm working with." Caleb shrugged. "Do what you want. Supper's at 6. He walked out, boots heavy on the wooden floor, and the door slammed behind him. Evelyn stood alone in the front room, surrounded by mess and silence, and felt the weight of every choice that had led her here. She could leave, find work in town, maybe catch another stagecoach and try somewhere else. But the laughter in Blackridge still echoed in her ears, and Thomas's face still haunted her sleep. And somewhere in Philadelphia, Vernon Mercer was living in a house built on stolen money while good people lost everything. She wasn't running again. Evelyn set down her bag, rolled up her sleeves, and walked into the kitchen. It took her 3 hours to make the kitchen functional. She hauled out 2 buckets of food scraps that had been festering in the corner. She scrubbed the stove until her hands ached. She found a broom with half its bristles missing and swept the floor 6 times before it looked even remotely clean. The pantry was a disaster. Half-empty sacks of flour, weevils in the cornmeal, jars of preserves that had gone bad months ago. Whoever had been managing this house before had stopped caring long before they quit. By the time the children came in for supper, Evelyn had managed to produce something edible: salt pork, beans, and cornbread that was slightly burned on the bottom, but mostly fine. She set the plates on the table, which she'd also scrubbed. Wyatt slouched into his chair without looking at her. Clara sat carefully, hands folded in her lap. Noah climbed onto his seat and immediately reached for the cornbread. "Wait for your father," Evelyn said. Wyatt snorted. "He doesn't care." "I do." The boy looked up at her then, his expression somewhere between challenge and surprise. "You gonna make us pray too, like the last one?" "No." "Good. Didn't work anyway." Caleb came in a moment later, hat in hand, and sat without a word. The children picked up their forks and started eating, no preamble, no conversation, just the mechanical process of consuming food. Evelyn sat down at the remaining seat, the one farthest from the stove, which had clearly been designated as hers by default. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were forks scraping plates and Noah chewing with his mouth open. Finally, Clara broke the silence, her voice small and uncertain. "The cornbread's good." "Thank you," Evelyn said. Wyatt rolled his eyes. "It's burned." "Then don't eat it," Evelyn said evenly. He stared at her, waiting for her to back down or apologize or show some sign that his opinion mattered. When she didn't, he shoved a piece of cornbread into his mouth and chewed aggressively. Caleb ate in silence, his focus on the plate in front of him like it was the only thing in the room. After 10 minutes, he stood, grabbed his hat, and walked out. Just like that. No thank you, or that was fine, or even acknowledgement that someone had spent 3 hours cleaning his filthy kitchen and cooking his supper. Evelyn watched him go, then looked at the children. Clara was staring at her plate. Noah was trying to sneak a second piece of cornbread. Wyatt was leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed, looking at her like he was waiting for her to do something interesting. "I'll wash the dishes," Evelyn said. "You can all go." "We have to help," Clara said quietly. "Pa says Not tonight. The girl blinked. But I'll handle it. Go. They left slowly, uncertain, like they weren't sure whether she was being kind or just incompetent. Noah was the last one out, clutching his wooden horse and glancing back at her twice before disappearing into the hallway. Evelyn cleared the table alone, hauled water from the pump, and washed every dish in silence. When she finished, the house was dark except for the single lantern she'd carried into the kitchen. Somewhere outside, a cow lowed. The wind rattled the loose board on the porch. She climbed the stairs to the second floor, found the room Caleb had indicated, and pushed open the door. It was small. A bed, a dresser, a window that didn't close all the way. Clean enough, but empty in the way that rooms get when nobody's cared about them for a long time. Evelyn lit the lantern on the dresser, opened her trunk, and pulled out the leather satchel she'd been carrying since Philadelphia. Inside were Thomas's papers, bills of sale, contracts, letters from lawyers. And buried at the bottom, a single newspaper clipping about Vernon Mercer's promotion to regional livestock broker, Montana Territory. She unfolded the clipping and stared at the grainy photograph of a man in an expensive suit, smiling like he'd just won something important. Evelyn set it on the dresser, smoothed out the creases, and let herself feel the anger she'd been swallowing since Nebraska. Then she pulled out Caleb's ranch ledger, which she'd noticed sitting on the desk in the front room, and opened it to the first page. She was good with numbers. Always had been. Thomas had run the print shop, but Evelyn had managed the books, tracked the payments, caught the discrepancies. She'd caught them too late. Not this time. She read until the lantern burned low and her eyes ached, tracking every cattle sale, every payment, every line of credit. The numbers didn't make sense. Caleb was selling cattle at weights that seemed reasonable, but the prices were too low, consistently. Every sale, every season, every year for the past 3 years. It looked like bad luck, bad timing, a struggling ranch caught in a rough market. But Evelyn knew better. She'd seen this pattern before, in Philadelphia, in the print shop books, in Thomas's contracts. Someone was stealing from Caleb Ryder, and if the name at the bottom of the broker contracts was who she thought it was, then the same man who destroyed her family was doing it again. Here, in Montana, to the man she'd just agreed to marry. Evelyn closed the ledger and stared out the window at the dark mountains beyond. She'd come west to escape the past. Instead, she'd walked straight back into it. The question was whether she'd run this time, or whether she'd finally fight back. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose window pane like it was trying to get in. Evelyn didn't sleep that night. She sat at the dresser with the ledger open, copying numbers into her own notebook, building a map of where the money was going and who was taking it. By dawn, she knew 3 things. First, Caleb Ryder's ranch was 6 months away from foreclosure. Second, the broker handling his cattle sales was a man named Vernon Mercer, Vernon Mercer's younger brother. And third, if she did nothing, this family would lose everything the same way hers had. So she made a choice. The same choice Thomas had made. The one that killed him. She'd find the proof. She'd expose the theft. She'd make sure the people responsible paid for what they'd done, even if it destroyed her, even if nobody believed her, even if Caleb Ryder himself told her to stop. The sun rose over Black Ridge, and Evelyn Hart went downstairs to make breakfast. The first full day started before sunrise, when Evelyn woke to the sound of boots on the stairs. Heavy, deliberate, heading down. She'd fallen asleep at the dresser sometime around 4, her face pressed against the open ledger, numbers swimming behind her closed eyes. She jolted upright, neck stiff, and stumbled to the window. Outside, Caleb was already crossing the yard toward the barn, shoulders hunched against the pre-dawn cold. The man apparently didn't believe in sleeping. Evelyn splashed water on her face from the basin, changed into a fresh dress that was already wilting in the summer heat, and headed downstairs. The kitchen was exactly as she'd left it, clean, organized, ready. That part felt good. The rest of the house, however, looked like it had been ransacked by someone specifically trying to undo her work from the previous day. Muddy boots by the door, a saddle blanket draped over the banister. 2 empty cups on the table, which meant someone had been up before her, made coffee, and left the evidence. She ignored it and started breakfast. By the time the children appeared, she had eggs fried, bacon crisping on the stove, and coffee that didn't taste like boiled dirt. Clara came down first, moving quietly like she was afraid to make noise. Noah followed, still half asleep, dragging his wooden horse by one leg. Wyatt was last. He stopped in the doorway, looked at the food on the table, then at Evelyn, and said, "Pa already ate." "Good for him." "He left at 5. I noticed. "So you're making food nobody asked for." Evelyn set a plate in front of Clara. "If you don't want it, don't eat it." Wyatt stood there for another few seconds, clearly trying to decide if arguing was worth the effort. Eventually, he sat down, grabbed 3 pieces of bacon, and ate them without looking at her. Clara ate carefully, cutting her eggs into small bites. Noah shoved an entire piece of bacon into his mouth and chewed, with his eyes half closed. "Where does your father usually eat?" Evelyn asked. "Barn," Clara said softly, "or the north pasture if he's already out there." "Does he come back for lunch?" "Sometimes." "And dinner?" "He tries." Wyatt snorted. "He doesn't try. He shows up when he shows up." Evelyn poured herself coffee and sat down across from them. "What happened to the last woman who worked here?" All 3 children went still. "She quit," Clara said after a long pause. "I know that part. I'm asking why." Nobody spoke. Noah looked at his sister. Clara looked at her plate. Wyatt stared directly at Evelyn with an expression that dared her to push harder. "Wyatt ran her off," Clara finally whispered. "Did he?" "She was mean," Wyatt said flatly. "She hit Noah. That changed things." Evelyn set down her coffee. "Hard?" "Hard enough." "What did your father do?" "Fired her." "Before or after you made her life miserable?" Wyatt's jaw tightened. "After." "But you helped," Evelyn said. Not a question. The boy didn't answer. He stood, grabbed his hat from the peg by the door, and walked out without another word. Clara watched him go, then looked at Evelyn with wide, worried eyes. "He's not bad. He just—" "I know," Evelyn said. "Finish your breakfast." She spent the rest of the morning attacking the house like it owed her money. She hauled buckets of water from the pump until her shoulders burned. She scrubbed floors that hadn't been properly cleaned in what looked like years. She found a dead mouse behind the stove and 3 broken dishes shoved under the sink and a bag of rotting potatoes in the pantry that smelled like something had died twice. By noon, the front room was livable. The kitchen was functional. The dining table no longer looked like a surface where diseases bred. She made lunch, bread and cheese and the last of the preserves that weren't spoiled, and set it on the table. Nobody came. Evelyn ate alone, staring out the window at the hills beyond. Somewhere out there, Caleb was working himself into an early grave. The children were scattered across the property, doing whatever children did when nobody supervised them. And she was standing in a kitchen in the middle of Montana Territory, trying to fix a family that didn't want fixing. She thought about Thomas, about the print shop, about the day the bank came and took everything while she stood on the sidewalk with a single trunk and nowhere to go. She thought about Vernon Mercer's face in that newspaper clipping, smiling like the world was his personal playground. Then she pushed away from the table, walked into the front room, and picked up Caleb's ledger again. She worked through the afternoon cross-referencing numbers, tracking patterns, building a timeline. The cattle sales went through a brokerage firm called Mercer & Sons, based out of Helena. Vern Mercer's name appeared on every contract. The weights listed seemed reasonable, 800 pounds per head, give or take, but the prices paid were consistently 15 to 20% below market rate. It looked like incompetence, like Caleb was just bad at negotiating. But when Evelyn compared his sales to the market reports from the Helena newspaper, which she found stacked in a corner, unread, the pattern became obvious. Every rancher selling through Mercer & Sons was getting the same low prices, every single one, for 3 years straight, which meant either the entire Montana Territory cattle market had collapsed and nobody noticed, or Vern Mercer was systematically underreporting weights and pocketing the difference. Evelyn knew which one it was. She'd seen her brother fight this exact fight. Different city, different business, same theft. Vernon Mercer had used shell companies and forged contracts. His brother was using falsified weight reports and manipulated scales. The method didn't matter. The result was the same. Good people losing everything while the Mercers got rich. She was still reading when Caleb came in at dusk, filthy and exhausted. He stopped when he saw her at the desk, ledger open, her notebook beside it covered in her own handwriting. "What are you doing?" he said. Looking at your books. Why? Because someone's stealing from you. Caleb stared at her like she'd just announced the sky was purple. What? Your cattle sales. The prices are wrong. He crossed the room slowly, his boots leaving dirt prints on the floor she'd scrubbed that morning. He looked at the ledger, then at her notebook, then at her face. You've been here one day? Yes. And you think you know more about my ranch than I do. I think I know when numbers don't add up. Caleb's expression went cold. The market's bad. It's been bad for years. That's not theft. That's just how things are. The market's fine, Evelyn said. I checked the Helena reports. Cattle are selling at $62 per head. You're getting $51. Mercer takes his commission. Not $11 worth. Caleb slammed the ledger shut so hard it made her jump. You don't know what you're talking about. You've been in Montana for 24 hours. You don't know the market. You don't know the territory. You sure as hell don't know Vern Mercer. I know his brother, Evelyn said quietly. That stopped him. What? Vernon Mercer, Philadelphia. He destroyed my family's business 3 years ago using the exact same method. Falsified contracts, redirected payments. By the time we caught it, we'd lost everything. Caleb stared at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his hat from the table. I don't need this. You need to know you're 6 months from foreclosure. He froze in the doorway. I read the bank letters, Evelyn continued. They're threatening to call the loan unless you make a payment by November. You can't make that payment at the rate Mercer's paying you, which means you'll lose the ranch, and your children will have nothing. Caleb turned slowly. His face was unreadable, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the doorframe. Who the hell do you think you are? He said, his voice low and dangerous. You show up here answering an advertisement and now you're going through my private papers and telling me how to run my business? I'm trying to help. I didn't ask for help. I asked for someone to cook and clean and stay out of my way. Then you should have been clear in your letters. They stared at each other across the room, the air thick with anger and exhaustion, and something else Evelyn couldn't name. Finally, Caleb said, Stay out of my business. Do your job. Keep the house running. That's it. He walked out, and this time he didn't just leave the room. She heard the front door slam, heard his boots on the porch steps, heard him cross the yard toward the barn. Evelyn sat alone in the front room as the light faded outside, staring at the closed ledger. She'd handled that badly, pushed too hard, too fast. Caleb didn't know her, didn't trust her. Why would he believe some stranger who'd been here less than 2 days? But she wasn't wrong. And if she did nothing, this family would end up exactly where hers had. She closed her notebook, hid it under the mattress in her room, and went to make dinner. The children ate in silence that night. Caleb didn't come back. When Evelyn asked where he was, Wyatt just shrugged and said, out, like it was the most normal thing in the world for a father to disappear after dark. She cleaned the kitchen alone again, then climbed the stairs to her room. Through the window, she could see a lantern burning in the barn. Caleb was out there, hiding, or working, or maybe just avoiding her. Fine. Let him avoid her. She had work to do. The next week fell into a brutal rhythm. Evelyn woke before dawn, made breakfast, cleaned the house, made lunch that nobody ate, cleaned some more, made dinner, and collapsed into bed with aching muscles and blistered hands. The work was relentless, the heat was suffocating, and the isolation was worse than anything she'd experienced in Philadelphia, where at least there were neighbors and streets and people who occasionally spoke to her. Here, there was just land. Miles and miles of empty land, broken up by cattle and the occasional fence post. Caleb kept his distance. He left early, came back late, and spoke to her only when absolutely necessary. Sentences like, need more coffee, or fence wires in the shed, or kids need to be at town by Saturday. Never thank you, or good meal, or I'm sorry I yelled at you. The children were only slightly better. Clara warmed up first, slowly, leaving small signs that she didn't hate Evelyn. A wildflower on the kitchen table one morning, a quiet, that was good, after dinner. A shy smile when Evelyn braided her hair. Noah was easy. He was 6. He liked anyone who fed him and didn't yell. By the end of the first week, he'd started following Evelyn around the kitchen, chattering about his wooden horse and the chicken he'd named Margaret, and the time Wyatt let him ride the big mare, even though Pa said not to. Wyatt remained a wall. He didn't yell, didn't argue, just moved through the house like she wasn't there taking what he needed and giving nothing back. Every time she tried to talk to him, he found a reason to leave. On the 8th day, Evelyn was scrubbing clothes in the yard when Clara came and sat beside her on the grass. "He's not always like this," the girl said quietly. "I know." "He was different before Mama died." Evelyn wrung out a shirt and draped it over the line. "What was he like?" "Happy. He used to joke around and teach me things. He's the one who showed me how to ride." Clara picked at the grass. "But after Mama got sick, he changed. Started acting like he had to take care of everything, like he was the grown-up." "And your father?" "Pa just went quiet. He works all the time. Even when he's here, he's not really here, you know?" Evelyn did know. She'd seen it in Thomas after their parents died. That look in someone's eyes that said they'd gone somewhere else and couldn't find their way back. "Wyatt doesn't trust people anymore," Clara continued. "The last woman who worked here, Mrs. Brennan, she seemed nice at first. But then she started getting mean, especially to Noah. She'd hit him when she thought nobody was looking." "How long did that go on?" "Maybe 2 months. Wyatt finally told Pa, but Pa didn't believe him at first, not until he saw it himself." Clara's voice dropped. "After Pa fired her, Wyatt said he'd never let anyone hurt us again. That's why he's mean to you. He's just waiting for you to turn bad." Evelyn sat back on her heels, staring at the wet laundry in her hands. "I'm not going to hurt any of you." "I know," Clara said, "but Wyatt doesn't." "Not yet." That night, Evelyn made stew. Real stew, not the watery version Caleb apparently considered acceptable. She used the last of the good beef, actual vegetables she'd found in the root cellar, and spices she'd brought from Philadelphia because she'd known frontier cooking would be desperate. When she called everyone to dinner, Caleb actually came. He sat down, looked at the bowl she set in front of him, and paused. "What is this?" he said. "Stew." "Smells different. It's not half water and regret. That's the difference." Wyatt choked on his first bite, but it might have been a laugh. Evelyn wasn't sure. They ate in silence for a few minutes. Then Noah, oblivious to the tension, said, "Miss Evelyn's teaching me numbers." Caleb looked up. "What?" "Numbers," Noah repeated. "She says I gotta know them so nobody cheats me when I'm big." Evelyn kept her eyes on her bowl. She hadn't meant it as a dig at Caleb, but she could feel him staring at her anyway. "That right?" he said flatly. "It's useful," Evelyn said. "Every child should know arithmetic." "Wyatt knows arithmetic." "Good for Wyatt." Another long silence. Then Clara, brave or foolish, said, "Miss Evelyn fixed the chicken coop. The wire was all torn." Caleb set down his spoon. "You fixed the coop?" "It needed fixing. That's ranch work. It was falling apart. The chickens were getting out. I would have handled it." "When?" The word came out sharper than Evelyn intended. She took a breath. "I'm not criticizing. I'm just saying it needed to be done, so I did it." Caleb stared at her for a long moment. Then he went back to his stew without another word. But he finished the whole bowl, and when he stood to leave, he paused and said, "Stew's good." It wasn't much, but it was something. The days bled into each other, each one hotter and harder than the last. Evelyn's hands developed calluses on top of calluses. Her back ached constantly. She lost weight she couldn't afford to lose because the work burned through calories faster than she could replace them. But the house started to look like a home. The floors stayed clean, the laundry got done, the meals appeared on time, and they were edible, which apparently was a significant upgrade. The children slowly, cautiously, started treating her like a person instead of an intruder. Clara talked more. Noah started calling her Miss Evie instead of Miss Evelyn. Even Wyatt stopped leaving the room every time she entered it, though he still didn't speak to her directly. And every night, after everyone was asleep, Evelyn pulled out her notebook and kept building her case against Vern Mercer. She found old bills of sale in a trunk in the attic. She compared weights from 3 years ago to weights now. She tracked every payment, every discrepancy, every pattern that screamed theft. By the end of the second week, she had enough evidence to know she was right. The question was what to do about it. Caleb had made it clear he didn't want her involved. But if she said nothing, the bank would take the ranch, and these children would lose the only home they had left. On the 15th day, a rider came up the road just after noon. Evelyn was in the garden, a pathetic square of dirt behind the house where someone had once tried to grow vegetables, pulling weeds, when she heard the horse. She stood, shading her eyes against the sun, and watched a man in an expensive suit dismount near the porch. He was tall, well-fed, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Everything about him screamed money and confidence and the kind of power that came from knowing you were untouchable. Evelyn's stomach dropped. She knew that smile. She'd seen it before, in a courtroom in Philadelphia, on the face of a man who'd destroyed her family and walked away laughing. The man knocked on the door. When nobody answered, he turned and saw Evelyn standing in the garden. "Afternoon," he called. "You must be the new Mrs. Ryder." Evelyn walked toward him slowly, wiping dirt from her hands. "We're not married yet." "Ah. Well, close enough, I suppose." He extended a hand. "Vern Mercer. I handle the cattle brokerage for this region." Of course he did. Evelyn didn't take his hand. "What do you want?" Mercer's smile tightened slightly. "Just checking in, making sure Caleb's ready for the fall sale. Big one coming up. Important year." "He's out working." "I can see that. Ranch looks better than last time I was here. Guess that's your doing." "I clean, that's all." "Well, you're doing a fine job." Mercer glanced around the property, his gaze lingering on the barn, the cattle in the distance, the house itself. "Caleb's had a rough few years, losing his wife, market being what it is. But he's a good man. Works hard. I do my best to get him fair prices." Evelyn felt her jaw tighten. "I'm sure you do. You sound skeptical." "I don't know you well enough to be skeptical." Mercer laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that said he'd registered the insult and filed it away. "Fair enough. Tell Caleb I stopped by, and that I'll be back next week to finalize the contracts for the fall shipment." He climbed back onto his horse, tipped his hat, and rode off down the road. Evelyn stood in the yard, watching him disappear into the heat shimmer, and felt something cold settle in her chest. Vern Mercer had just come to size up the property, to make sure Caleb was desperate enough to accept whatever terms he offered, to remind everyone who held the power here. And he'd looked at Evelyn like she was part of the furniture. That night, she waited until Caleb came in for dinner. The children were already eating when he sat down, exhausted and covered in dust. Evelyn set a plate in front of him. Vern Mercer came by today. Caleb's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "What did he want?" "To check on you, and to remind you about the fall sale. That's 3 weeks out. He said he'd be back next week to finalize contracts." Caleb set down his fork. And I think you should check the scales before you agree to anything." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Wyatt stopped eating. Claire's eyes went wide. Caleb stood slowly. "I told you to stay out of my business. I'm trying to help you keep your ranch. By insulting the one man who's kept me afloat for 3 years? He's not keeping you afloat. He's drowning you slowly." Caleb's voice went dangerously quiet. "Get out." "What?" "Get out of this room, now." Evelyn stood her ground. "Not until you listen. I don't want to hear it. I don't want your theories or your numbers or your conspiracy stories about some man in Philadelphia. Vern Mercer is a respected businessman. He has contracts with half the ranches in this territory. And you're a woman who's been here 2 weeks and thinks she knows everything. I know theft when I see it." "Get out!" The shout made Noah start crying. Clara grabbed her little brother's hand. Wyatt stared at his plate, his face carefully blank.
Evelyn looked at Caleb, really looked at him, and saw a man who was drowning and refusing the rope because he was too proud to admit he needed help. She walked out of the kitchen, climbed the stairs to her room, and closed the door. She could hear Caleb downstairs, his voice lower now, probably comforting Noah. Then the sound of boots, the front door slamming. He'd left again. Evelyn sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her notebook, and made a decision.
If Caleb wouldn't listen, she'd make him listen. If he wouldn't fight for his ranch, she'd fight for him. And if that meant going directly to Vern Mercer herself, then that's what she'd do. She opened the notebook to a fresh page and started writing a list. Evidence she still needed, people she'd have to talk to, ways to prove the scales were rigged without getting herself killed in the process. Outside, the sun set over the Montana hills, and somewhere in the growing darkness, Vern Mercer was counting his money. But Evelyn Hart had been underestimated her entire life, and she was done being quiet. The morning after their fight, Caleb left before sunrise without saying a word. Evelyn heard the barn door slam and watched from her window as he rode out toward the north pasture, his silhouette swallowed by the pre-dawn gray. She went downstairs and made breakfast anyway. The children came down one by one, sensing the tension the way children always did. Noah was subdued, picking at his eggs. Claire kept glancing toward the empty chair at the head of the table. Wyatt ate standing up by the door, like he was ready to bolt at any second. "Where's Pa?" Noah finally asked. "Working," Evelyn said. "Is he mad?" "Yes." "At you?" "Yes." Noah absorbed this, his small face serious. "Are you leaving?" The question hit harder than Evelyn expected. She set down the coffee pot and looked at the boy. "No. Mrs. Brennan left when Pa got mad." "I'm not Mrs. Brennan." Wyatt made a sound that might have been agreement or skepticism. Hard to tell. He grabbed his hat and walked out, letting the door bang shut behind him.
Clara helped clear the table without being asked, moving quietly like she was afraid loud noises might shatter something. When the last dish was washed, she turned to Evelyn and said, "He'll get over it. Pa, I mean. He always does." "Does he?" "Eventually." Clara hesitated. "But maybe don't talk about Mr. Mercer for a while." Evelyn dried her hands on her apron and looked out the window at the empty yard. "I'll try." But trying and doing were different things, and Evelyn had never been good at staying quiet when she knew something was wrong. She spent the morning cleaning rooms that were already clean, just to have something to do with her hands. By noon, the heat was unbearable, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and turned the inside of the house into an oven. Evelyn was hanging laundry when she noticed the sky. It had been clear at dawn. Now, dark clouds were building over the western ridge, towering and strange-looking. Not rain clouds. Something else. She was still staring when Clara came running from the direction of the barn. "Miss Evelyn, Wyatt says there's smoke." Evelyn dropped the wet shirt she was holding and shaded her eyes. Sure enough, a thin grey line rose from somewhere beyond the hills, barely visible against the darker clouds. "Where's your father?" "North pasture with the herd." "How far?" "Maybe 3 miles." Evelyn's chest tightened. 3 miles if the fire was coming from the west and Caleb was to the north with the cattle. "Get your brother," she said. "Both of them. Bring them to the house." Clara ran. Evelyn went inside, grabbed the emergency bell Caleb kept by the door, and rang it hard. The sound carried across the property, sharp and urgent. Wyatt appeared first, riding in fast from wherever he'd been. He swung down from his horse and saw Evelyn's face. "What?" "Fire. Western Ridge." He turned and looked, squinting into the distance. "Could just be lightning strike. Happens all the time." "Does the smoke usually spread that fast?" Even as she said it, the grey line thickened, darkening, spreading like spilled ink across the sky. Wyatt swore. "We need to get the cattle in. If that fire jumps the creek, where's your father?" "Out there with them." "Can you reach him?" "Not before the fire does." They stared at each other for a beat. Then Wyatt was moving, shouting orders Evelyn barely registered. Clara appeared with Noah, both of them wide-eyed and scared. "Take them to the root cellar," Wyatt told Evelyn. "If the fire comes this way, I'm not hiding in a cellar while your father's out there. You can't do anything. Neither can you. You're 15. Wyatt's jaw clenched. "I've been doing ranch work since I was 12. And I've been keeping this family fed for 3 weeks. Don't tell me what I can't do." For a second, she thought he might argue. Instead, something shifted in his expression, something that looked almost like respect. "Fine," he said, "but stay close and do what I say." He rode out before she could respond, heading toward the smoke at a speed that made Evelyn's heart lurch. She turned to Clara. "Take Noah to the cellar. Lock it from inside. Don't come out until someone comes for you." "What about you?" "I'll be fine." "Miss Evelyn." "Go." Clara grabbed Noah's hand and ran. Evelyn watched them disappear into the cellar behind the house, then looked back at the western ridge. The smoke was definitely spreading now, and beneath it, barely visible, was an orange glow that hadn't been there 5 minutes ago. She ran to the barn, grabbed the first horse she saw, a grey mare that looked less likely to throw her than the others, and somehow managed to haul herself into the saddle. Her riding experience consisted of exactly 3 lessons back in Philadelphia when she was 16, none of which had prepared her for this. The mare seemed to sense her incompetence and responded with the patience of a creature deeply resigned to human stupidity. Evelyn kicked her heels the way she'd seen Wyatt do. The mare started forward at a trot that rattled every bone in Evelyn's body. By the time she reached the north pasture, the fire had jumped the ridge. She could see it clearly now, a wall of flame moving through the dry grass like something alive and hungry. The wind was driving it east, directly toward where Caleb and Wyatt were trying to move the herd. Cattle were everywhere, panicked and scattering. Caleb was on horseback, shouting orders she couldn't hear over the roar of the fire. Wyatt was trying to turn a group of steers away from the flames, but they kept breaking formation, driven by pure terror. Evelyn rode toward them, nearly falling off twice when the mare spooked. She reached Caleb just as he turned and saw her. His face went from shock to fury in half a second. "What the hell are you doing here? Helping! Get back to the house. The children are safe." A section of the ridge above them exploded in flame, sending a shower of sparks into the air. The cattle bolted. Caleb swore and rode after them, leaving Evelyn alone in the choking smoke. She couldn't see Wyatt anymore. Couldn't see much of anything except fire and smoke and cattle running in every direction like the world was ending. Then she heard it, faint, barely audible over the chaos, a child screaming. Evelyn's blood went cold. She'd told Clara to take Noah to the cellar. She'd watched them go, but that was definitely a child's voice, high and terrified, coming from somewhere to her left. She turned the mare and rode toward the sound, her eyes streaming from the smoke. The voice was coming from the ravine, the narrow gully that cut through the property, steep-sided and rocky, the kind of place children were specifically told never to go near. Evelyn dismounted badly, nearly twisting her ankle, and ran to the edge. 20 feet down, wedged between 2 boulders, was Noah. He was crying, his face streaked with dirt and tears, clutching his wooden horse like it was the only solid thing in the world. "Noah?" He looked up, saw her, and sobbed harder. "I'm stuck." "What are you doing here?" I told Clara. "I wanted to see the fire. I didn't mean to fall." Above them, the fire was getting closer. Evelyn could feel the heat on her back, hear the crackling roar as it consumed everything in its path. She looked down into the ravine. The sides were steep but not vertical. Loose rock, some scrub brush, a few roots sticking out that might hold weight, or might not. Behind her, someone was shouting her name, Caleb probably, or Wyatt. She ignored it. She sat down on the edge, swung her legs over, and started climbing down. The first few feet weren't bad. Then her boot slipped on loose shale, and she slid 5 feet before catching herself on a root that tore a chunk out of her palm. Blood welled up hot and immediate. "Miss Evie!" Noah's voice was pure panic now. "I'm coming. Stay still." She kept climbing. Her skirt caught on rocks and thorns. Her hands were bleeding. Every breath tasted like smoke and copper. She was 10 feet from Noah when the fire reached the top of the ravine. The heat slammed into her like a physical thing. She looked up and saw flames eating through the scrub along the rim, sparks raining down like deadly snow. Noah screamed. Evelyn pushed herself down the last section too fast, half falling, and hit the bottom hard enough to knock the wind out of her lungs. She crawled to where Noah was wedged between the boulders, her vision swimming. "I can't get out," he sobbed. "My leg's stuck." She looked. His left foot was caught in a gap between the rocks, twisted at an angle that made her stomach turn. She could pull him free, but it was going to hurt. "Noah, listen to me. I need you to be brave, okay? It hurts. I know, but we have to move right now." Above them, a burning branch fell into the ravine and landed 6 feet away, still flaming. Evelyn grabbed Noah under the arms. On 3, 1, she yanked him free. He screamed, a sound that cut through everything else, but his foot came loose and he collapsed against her, sobbing into her shoulder. "I "I've got you," she said, even though she wasn't sure she did. "I've got you." She looked up at the ravine wall, 20 feet, steep, loose rock, and at the top, fire. There was no way she could climb back up carrying a 6-year-old, but staying down here meant burning alive. She pulled Noah onto her back, his arms tight around her neck, and started climbing. Her hands were slippery with blood. Every handhold felt uncertain. Noah's weight threw off her balance, and twice she nearly fell. Behind them, more burning debris fell into the ravine, the smoke so thick now she could barely see 3 feet ahead. Halfway up, her boot slipped. She slid backward, caught herself on a jutting rock that cut deep into her forearm, and held on through sheer, stubborn refusal to let go. "We're gonna die," Noah whimpered. "No, we're not." "I'm scared." "Me too. Keep holding on." She climbed, hand over hand, foot over foot, her muscles screaming, her lungs on fire. The world narrowed to the next handhold, the next foothold, the next breath. 10 feet from the top, she heard voices. "Evelyn!" Caleb's voice, rough and desperate in a way she'd never heard before. "Down here!" she tried to shout, but it came out as a croak. A shape appeared at the rim. Wyatt, his face black with soot. He saw them and yelled something over his shoulder. "Can you reach him?" Evelyn called up. Wyatt lay flat on his stomach and stretched down. His fingers were 3 feet short. "You gotta come higher." Evelyn looked at the remaining distance. The rock here was unstable, crumbling under her weight. One wrong move and they'd both fall. She pushed up anyway. Her right boot slipped. She caught herself, pushed again. Wyatt's hand closed around Noah's arm. "I got him, let go." It went against every instinct, but Evelyn loosened her grip. Wyatt pulled and Noah came free, scrambling up over the rim with help from someone else. Caleb, she realized, lying beside his son. "Your turn," Wyatt shouted down. "Come on." Evelyn reached up, her hand closed around his wrist, just as the rock beneath her left foot gave way completely. She dropped, her full weight suddenly hanging from Wyatt's grip. The boy grunted, his face going red with effort. "Don't let go," she said, though it came out barely audible. "Wasn't planning on it." Another hand grabbed her other arm, Caleb. Between the two of them, they hauled her up over the rim and onto solid ground. For a moment, all 4 of them just lay there in the dirt, coughing and gasping while fire burned all around them. Then Caleb grabbed her shoulders and pulled her upright with enough force to make her head spin. His face was wild, furious, terrified. "What the hell were you thinking?" Evelyn coughed. "He was stuck. You could have died." "So could he." Caleb stared at her and something in his expression cracked. He pulled Noah against his chest, holding the boy so tight it must have hurt. "You stupid, reckless—" "We need to move," Wyatt interrupted. "Fire's closing in." He was right. The flames had them surrounded on 3 sides. The only path out was east, back toward the house, and even that was filling with smoke. Caleb lifted Noah onto his horse, then swung up behind him. "Wyatt, take Mrs. Hart." "Miss Evelyn," Evelyn corrected automatically. "Whatever. Move." Wyatt pulled her up behind him. She wrapped her arms around the boy's waist and held on as he kicked the horse into a gallop. They rode through smoke so thick she couldn't see the ground, trusting the horses to find the path. Burning embers fell around them like snow. The heat was unbearable. And then they were through it, breaking into clear air, the house visible ahead. Clara was standing in the yard, screaming their names. When she saw them coming, she ran forward, tears streaming down her face. They dismounted in a chaos of movement. Noah was limping, his ankle already swelling. Caleb's hands were burned. Wyatt was coughing so hard he couldn't speak, and Evelyn felt like she'd been beaten with rocks and then set on fire for good measure. But they were alive. Clara threw herself at Noah, nearly knocking him over. "You idiot! You stupid idiot! I told you to stay in the cellar." "I wanted to see. You almost died." Noah started crying again. Clara hugged him anyway. Caleb stood a few feet away, staring at Evelyn like he was seeing her for the first time. His face was unreadable, streaked with soot and sweat, his eyes reflecting the fire still burning in the distance. "You went down there," he said quietly, "into the ravine." He was stuck. "You could have died." "You already said that. I mean it." Evelyn looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a man who just had every wall he'd built blown apart in the space of 20 minutes. "I wasn't going to leave him," she said. Caleb opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came out. Finally, he just turned and walked toward the barn, his shoulders tight, his movements mechanical. Wyatt watched him go, then looked at Evelyn. "He's not mad. He looks mad." "He's not. He's just—" Wyatt paused, searching for words. "Nobody's done something like that for us before. Not since Ma." The comparison hit Evelyn somewhere deep. She didn't know what to say, so she just nodded. "That was stupid, though," Wyatt added. "Going down there. Really stupid. I know. But—" He hesitated. "Thanks." It was the first time he'd thanked her for anything. The first time he'd looked at her like she was someone who mattered instead of someone he was waiting to leave. Evelyn managed a smile that felt more like a grimace. "You're welcome." The fire burned through the night. They watched it from the yard, the whole family gathered together as the western ridge glowed orange against the black sky. The wind shifted around midnight, pushing the fire north away from the ranch, and by dawn it had burned itself out against the creek. They'd lost maybe 40 head of cattle. Could have been worse. Could have lost everything. Could have lost Noah. Caleb didn't sleep. Evelyn could see him from her window, standing in the yard, staring at the burned hills like he was counting everything he'd almost lost. She went downstairs around 3 a.m, made coffee, and carried a cup out to him. He took it without looking at her. They stood in silence, the only sound the distant settling of burned wood. Finally, Caleb said, "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For everything. For treating you like hired help, for yelling at you about Mercer, for—" He stopped. "For not seeing what you were trying to do." Evelyn wrapped her arms around herself against the cold. "You were protecting your family. I understand that. I was being stubborn and blind." He turned to look at her, and in the faint moonlight his face looked older, worn down by years of fighting alone. "You saved my son. Anyone would have—" "No, they wouldn't have. Most people would have waited for help or tried to get me, or stood at the top and hoped for the best." His voice went rough. "You climbed down into that ravine without thinking twice. You carried him back up through fire. You risked your life for a child who isn't even yours." "He's a child, that's enough." Caleb was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I looked at Mercer's contracts again tonight. Really looked." Evelyn's heart skipped. "And?" "The weights don't match my counts. Haven't for 3 years." He took a shaky breath. "You were right. Someone's been stealing from me and I've been too proud to see it. It's not about pride. It's exactly about pride. I thought I knew better. Thought I had everything under control. Meanwhile, my ranch was dying and my children were going hungry, and I blamed everyone except the man who was actually robbing me blind." He looked at her. "How did you know?" "Because it happened to my family. Same method, different city. By the time we figured it out, it was too late." "But you figured it out here in 3 weeks." I knew what to look for. Caleb was silent for another long moment. Then he said, "What do I do now?" It was the first time he'd asked her opinion, the first time he treated her like a partner instead of a problem. Evelyn chose her words carefully. "We need proof, real proof, not just suspicions. Something we can take to the territorial authorities that they can't ignore. Mercer's coming back next week to finalize the 4 contracts. Then we have 6 days to figure out how to catch him." "You keep saying we. Do you want me to say you instead?" "No." Caleb looked out at the burned hills. "No, I don't." They stood together in the darkness, drinking bad coffee and watching the sky slowly lighten. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. The chickens started making noise in their repaired coop. The world kept turning, indifferent to human struggle, but something had changed. Evelyn could feel it in the air between them, in the way Caleb stood a little closer than he had before, in the way he'd said we instead of telling her to stay out of it. She'd proven herself. not through words or arguments, but through action, through climbing into a burning ravine because a child needed help and nobody else was there to do it. The people who'd laughed at her stepping off that stagecoach 3 weeks ago had been wrong. And Caleb Ryder finally knew it. "He'll be here Tuesday," Caleb said. "Mercer, coming to finalize the contract. Then we'll be ready for him. You really think we can prove it? I know we can." Caleb turned to look at her, really look at her. And for the first time since she'd arrived, there was something in his eyes besides exhaustion and suspicion. It looked almost like hope. "All right," he said, "show me what you've got." They went inside as the sun rose over Montana territory, and Evelyn spread her notebooks across the kitchen table like battle plans. The war was just beginning. They spent the next morning going through 3 years of contracts spread across the kitchen table like evidence at a crime scene. Caleb's handwriting was terrible, his record keeping even worse, but the numbers told the story clearly enough once you knew what to look for. "Here," Evelyn said, pointing to a sale from 18 months ago. "You recorded 83 head at an average of £820 each. Mercer's receipt says 760. Caleb leaned over her shoulder, squinting at the paper. "That's a £60 difference per animal. Multiply that by 83 head. He did the math in his head. Near £5,000. At 6 cents a pound, that's $300 he didn't pay you for one sale." Evelyn flipped to another contract. "And here, 91 head. You counted 810 average. He reported 740. "Son of a," Caleb caught himself, glanced toward the doorway where Clara was pretending not to listen. "How many sales are like this?" "Every single one for the past 3 years. The color drained from Caleb's face. "How much total?" Evelyn had already done that calculation. She'd done it 3 times to make sure. Roughly $4,000. The number hung in the air between them like something physical and poisonous. 4,000, Caleb repeated quietly. "That's almost what I owe the bank." "Not almost. It's exactly what you owe the bank, plus the interest they've been charging you because you couldn't make payments." Caleb sat down hard in the nearest chair. For a long moment, he just stared at the papers, his jaw working, like he was trying to process information his brain didn't want to accept. "I should have caught this," he finally said. "I'm not stupid. I know my cattle. I count them myself before every sale." "You trusted someone you thought was trustworthy. That's not stupid. That's normal. Normal people don't lose their ranch because they're too blind to see they're being robbed." "My brother wasn't blind either," Evelyn said quietly. "He was a smart man, ran a successful business for 20 years. Vernon Mercer still destroyed him because Thomas believed people were basically honest. By the time he realized they weren't, it was too late." Caleb looked up at her. "What happened to him? Your brother?" "He died fighting it. Heart attack on the courthouse steps." The words still hurt to say even now. He spent 6 months trying to prove what Vernon had done. Filed complaints, hired lawyers, stood in front of judges. Nobody believed him. They said he was making excuses for his own bad business decisions. And were they right? No, but it didn't matter. Vernon Mercer had money and reputation and friends in the right places. Thomas had paperwork and accusations. Guess which one won? Caleb was quiet for a beat. Then he said, "I'm not dying on any courthouse steps." "Good, neither am I. So what's the plan? Take this to the territorial marshal? Hope he believes us more than they believed your brother?" Evelyn had been thinking about that question for 3 days straight. "No, we take it to the other ranchers." "What?" "Mercer's not just stealing from you. He's stealing from every rancher in the territory who uses his brokerage. If we can prove it to them, show them the pattern in their own books, they'll demand an investigation. The marshal can't ignore 50 angry ranchers." Caleb rubbed his face. "You're talking about going public, making accusations against one of the most powerful men in Montana territory." "Yes, if we're wrong, we're not wrong. If we can't prove it, and we can prove it, the numbers are right here." Evelyn tapped the contracts. "All we need is for people to look at them honestly." And you think they will? After they laughed at you getting off that stagecoach, after they've spent 3 weeks making jokes about Caleb Ryder's fat wife. The words stung more than Evelyn wanted to admit, but she kept her voice level. They'll listen if you tell them to. I'm not exactly popular in town. You're a rancher. You've lived here your whole life. You have standing, even if you don't think you do. She met his eyes across the table. And after yesterday, after what happened with Noah, people know I'm not just some soft city woman who's going to run at the first sign of trouble. Caleb studied her face for a long moment. You really think you can do this? Stand up in front of a room full of people who've been mocking you and convince them you're right? I stood up in front of a ravine full of fire yesterday. This can't be worse than that. A ghost of a smile crossed Caleb's face. Fair point. The door banged open and Wyatt came in, tracking mud across the floor Evelyn had scrubbed that morning. He saw the papers spread across the table and stopped. What's going on? Your father and I are planning to destroy Vern Mercer's business, Evelyn said. Wyatt blinked. Seriously? Seriously. The boy looked at Caleb, who nodded confirmation. She's been right about everything else. Figure I should start listening. Something shifted in Wyatt's expression. Surprise giving way to something that looked almost like excitement. What do you need me to do? Can you ride to the McAllister ranch? Caleb asked. Tell Jim I need to see him, today if possible. Tell him it's about his cattle sales. What about the Hendersons and the Pratts? Them too, anyone who sells through Mercer and Sons. Tell them I have information they need to hear. Wyatt grabbed his hat. They're gonna ask what it's about. Tell them I've been robbed, and I can prove they have been too. The boy was out the door before Caleb finished the sentence, moving with the kind of purpose Evelyn hadn't seen from him before, like he'd been waiting months for someone to give him something important to do. Clara appeared in the doorway, Noah limping behind her. The little boy's ankle was wrapped in strips of cloth Evelyn had torn from an old shirt, and his face still had smudges of soot she hadn't been able to scrub off. Are you really gonna fight Mr. Mercer? Clara asked quietly. Yes, Evelyn said. What if he wins? He won't. But what if he does? Evelyn looked at the girl's worried face and decided she deserved honesty. Then we'll lose the ranch and we'll have to start over somewhere else. Where would we go? I don't know, but we'd figure it out. Noah tugged on Evelyn's skirt. Would you come with us? The question caught her off guard. She looked down at the boy's earnest face, then at Clara's, then at Caleb, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Yes, she said, I'd come with you. Noah seemed satisfied with that answer. He limped over to the table and climbed into a chair to stare at the papers like they were personally offensive. Mr. Mercer's mean. Very mean, Evelyn agreed. Is he going to yell at you? Probably. Are you scared? Evelyn thought about that question. Was she scared? Yes. Terrified, actually. But fear had never stopped her from doing what needed to be done, and it wasn't going to start now. A little, she admitted, but I'm more angry than scared. Good, Noah said with a child's absolute certainty. You should be mad. He tried to take our house. Caleb reached over and ruffled his son's hair. He hasn't taken it yet. By late afternoon, Wyatt had returned with news. Jim McAllister would come by tomorrow. The Hendersons couldn't make it until the weekend, but they'd send their foreman. The Pratts wanted to know if this had something to do with their last cattle sale, because those numbers hadn't seemed right either. Word spreading, Wyatt said. Half the ranchers between here and Helena are talking about it. Some think you've lost your mind. Others are checking their own books. And Mercer? Caleb asked. Has he heard? If he hasn't yet, he will by morning, which meant they needed to move fast. If Mercer got wind of what was happening, he'd either run or he'd lawyer up, possibly both. They needed to force his hand before he had time to cover his tracks. We need a public forum, Evelyn said. Somewhere we can present the evidence where everyone can see it at once. Make it so he can't deny it or deflect. Town hall meeting, Caleb suggested. Too formal. Too easy for him to control the narrative. Evelyn paced the kitchen, thinking, what about the church? Church services aren't until Sunday. Not a service, a meeting, Saturday night. Invite every rancher in the territory. Tell them you have proof of fraud and you're going public with it. Caleb absorbed that. You want to ambush him in a church. I want to trap him in a room full of witnesses where he can't lie his way out. Pastor Williams won't like it. Pastor Williams lost 40 head last year through Mercer's brokerage. I bet he'll be very interested in knowing why. A slow smile spread across Caleb's face. You're dangerous, you know that? I've been told. They spent the next 2 days gathering evidence and spreading word. Caleb rode out to neighboring ranches, talking to men he'd known for decades, showing them the discrepancies in his own books and asking them to check theirs. Evelyn stayed at the ranch, organizing documents, creating timelines, building an argument that couldn't be picked apart by lawyers or dismissed as sour grapes. Jim McAllister came by on Thursday, a weathered man in his 60s who'd been ranching since before Montana was a territory. He sat at the kitchen table, studied Evelyn's numbers, and went very quiet. Son of a bitch, he finally said. Pardon my language, ma'am, but son of a bitch. You see it? Caleb asked. I see it. Been selling through Mercer for 5 years. Never thought to question the weights because his operation seemed so professional. Receipts always looked official. Payments always came through. He shook his head slowly. I'm a damn fool. You're not a fool, Evelyn said. You're a victim. There's a difference. How much has he taken from me? Evelyn had already done the calculation based on the documents McAllister had brought, roughly $2,300. The number hit McAllister like a physical blow. He sat back in his chair, his face going pale. That's enough to buy another 100 head, enough to expand my operation, enough to... He stopped, his hand shaking slightly. My son wanted to start his own ranch last year. I told him we couldn't afford to help. Turned out we could have if Mercer hadn't been robbing me blind. There's going to be a meeting Saturday night, Caleb said, at the church. We're presenting this to everyone. You should be there. Oh, I'll be there, McAllister said grimly. And I'm bringing every rancher I know. Mercer's finished. He just doesn't know it yet. Word spread like the fire that had nearly killed them all. By Friday, half the territory knew something big was happening Saturday night at Black Ridge Church. The other half had heard rumors and wanted to know if they were true. Vern Mercer himself showed up Friday afternoon. Evelyn was in the garden, still a pathetic square of dirt, but slightly less pathetic than before, when she heard the horse. She looked up and saw him riding toward the house, alone this time, his expensive suit already dusty from the road. She stood, brushed dirt from her hands, and walked to meet him. Mercer dismounted with practiced ease and smiled at her like they were old friends. Mrs. Hart, good to see you again. Mr. Mercer, I hear there's some kind of meeting tomorrow night, something about cattle sales. That's right. Mind telling me what it's about? Evelyn met his eyes steadily. Fraud, theft. 3 years of systematically robbing ranchers through falsified weight reports. The smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered behind Mercer's eyes. Those are serious accusations. They're serious crimes. Based on what evidence? Sales records, weight discrepancies, market comparisons, pattern analysis across multiple ranches and multiple years. Mercer absorbed that information, his smile finally fading. You've been busy. I have. Does Caleb know you're making accusations that could destroy his relationship with the only broker willing to work with him? It was Caleb's idea to go public. Oh, that surprised him. Evelyn could see it in the slight widening of his eyes, the pause before he spoke again. I see. Well, I suppose I'll have to attend this meeting myself. Set the record straight. You should definitely attend, Evelyn said. It wouldn't be complete without you. Mercer studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he tipped his hat and climbed back on his horse. See you tomorrow night, Mrs. Hart. He rode away slowly, like he had all the time in the world. Evelyn watched until he disappeared over the ridge, then went inside where Caleb was watching from the window. "He knows," she said. "Good. Let him sweat." Saturday arrived hot and tense. Evelyn spent the morning reviewing her notes one final time, making sure every number was correct, every citation accurate, every argument solid. She couldn't afford mistakes, not today. By evening, people were already gathering at the church. Ranchers came in from all over the territory, some traveling hours to be there. They filled the pews, stood along the walls, crowded the doorway. The building hadn't seen this many people since Christmas. Evelyn arrived with Caleb and the children just as the sun was setting. She'd worn her best dress, which wasn't saying much, and braided her hair carefully. She wanted to look respectable, professional, like someone worth listening to. The crowd went quiet when they entered. Evelyn could feel every eye on her as they walked down the aisle toward the front. She heard whispers, saw people leaning together to murmur comments she couldn't quite make out. Some faces were curious, others skeptical, a few outright hostile. And then there was Vern Mercer, sitting in the third row like he owned the place, his expensive suit freshly pressed, his expression calm and confident. Pastor William stood at the front, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Folks, thank you for coming. Caleb Ryder has asked to address you all regarding some concerns about cattle sales in the territory. I've agreed to host this meeting as a neutral party. Whatever's said here tonight, I ask that we keep it civil and listen with open minds." Caleb stood, and Evelyn could see his hands shaking slightly. He wasn't used to public speaking, wasn't comfortable being the center of attention, but he walked to the front anyway and turned to face the crowd. "Most of you know me," he started. "I've ranched in this territory my whole life. My father ranched here before me. I'm not a man prone to wild accusations or conspiracy theories, but 3 weeks ago a woman showed up at my ranch and told me I was being robbed. I didn't believe her." He paused. "I should have." He gestured for Evelyn to join him. She stood on legs that felt unsteady and walked to his side. "This is Evelyn Hart," Caleb continued. "She's been managing my household and keeping my books. And she found something I'd been too stubborn to see. For the past 3 years, someone has been systematically underreporting the weight of my cattle and pocketing the difference. The total theft is roughly $4,000. The crowd erupted in murmurs. Mercer remained perfectly still, his face showing nothing. "That's a bold claim," someone called from the back. "Can you prove it?" "Yes," Evelyn said, and was surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "I can prove it right now. If every rancher here who sold through Mercer and Sons will check their own records against the market reports, you'll find the same pattern. Consistent underreporting. Every sale, every season for years." "Market prices fluctuate," Mercer said smoothly, standing up. "Everyone knows that. Sometimes you get a good price, sometimes you don't. That's not theft, that's business." "Then explain this," Evelyn said. She held up a document. "This is Caleb's sale from last September. 83 head. He recorded an average weight of 820 per animal. Your receipt says 760. That's a 60-pound difference per head. Scales can vary. Not by 60 pounds, not consistently, not for 3 years straight." Evelyn pulled out another document. "Jim McAllister's sale from last March. 71 head. He counted 815 average. Your receipt says 750. Jim McAllister stood up. "That's true. I just checked my books. The numbers don't match." "Because ranchers don't know how to count," Mercer said with a patronizing smile. "No offense, Jim, but you're estimating weights in the field. We're using certified scales at the stockyard. Our numbers are accurate." "Then why are they consistently lower than every rancher's estimate?" Evelyn countered. "Why is there never a sale where your weights are higher than expected? It's always lower, every single time, for every single rancher." "That's because ranchers overestimate. I compared your reported weights to market averages for Montana Territory cattle," Evelyn interrupted. "The average weight for mature cattle sold through legitimate brokers is 790 to 820 pounds. Your reported weights average 740 to 760, 20 to 80 pounds lower than the territorial average every year, every sale. The crowd was getting louder now, ranchers pulling out their own records, comparing numbers, realizing the pattern was real. Mercer's confidence was starting to crack. "This is speculation. This is mathematics," Evelyn said, "and it's systematic. You've been stealing from every rancher in this room, small amounts from each sale, spread over years, counting on the fact that no one would notice because the theft was gradual and the ranchers trusted you. I've built my reputation on honesty." "Your brother built his reputation on honesty too," Evelyn said quietly. "Right up until he destroyed my family's business in Philadelphia using the exact same method. Falsified documents, redirected payments. By the time we proved it, we'd lost everything." The room went completely silent. Mercer stared at her, and for the first time she saw recognition in his eyes. "You're Thomas Hart's sister." "I am." Thomas Hart was a failed businessman who blamed everyone but himself. "Thomas Hart was murdered by your brother's fraud," Evelyn said, her voice shaking with fury she could no longer contain. "He died trying to prove what Vernon had done. And now you're doing the same thing here to these people, thinking nobody will catch you because you're respected, and they're just ranchers who don't know any better." "That's a lie." "Then prove it," Caleb said, stepping forward. "Open your books. Let the territorial marshal examine your scales. If you're innocent, you've got nothing to hide." Mercer looked around the room and seemed to realize for the first time that he'd lost the crowd. Faces that had been neutral were now hostile. Men who trusted him were standing up, pulling out their own records, demanding answers. "This is ridiculous," he said, but his voice had lost its confidence. "You can't possibly believe some outsider who's been here 3 weeks over a man who served this community for years." "I believe the numbers," Jim McAllister said, "and the numbers say you're a thief." Another rancher stood. "I want a marshal to check those scales." "And I want restitution," someone else called. "And I want to know why the hell I trusted you with my livelihood," said a third voice. The room erupted in angry voices, everyone talking at once. Mercer tried to speak over them, tried to regain control, but it was too late. The truth was out and there was no putting it back. Pastor Williams called for order. It took several minutes for the crowd to settle down. When they finally quieted, Caleb said, "I'm calling for an official investigation into Mercer and Sons. I'm requesting the territorial marshal examine the brokerages, scales, and records. And I'm asking every rancher here to file a formal complaint." "Seconded," McAllister said immediately. "Thirded," someone else called. The vote was unanimous. Every hand in the room went up except Mercer's. He stood there surrounded by people who trusted him and seemed to realize his empire was crumbling in real time. His face went pale, then red, then pale again. "You'll regret this," he said to Evelyn, his voice low and venomous. "All of you, you have no idea what you've started." "We've started justice," Evelyn said quietly. "That's all." Mercer turned and pushed his way through the crowd towards the door. People moved aside to let him pass, their expressions ranging from anger to satisfaction to grim determination. When he was gone, the room exhaled collectively. Pastor Williams cleared his throat. "I'll draft a letter to the territorial marshal tonight. We'll need everyone who sold through Mercer and Sons to document their sales and file official complaints. This needs to be done properly, by the law." "Agreed," Caleb said. People started talking again, but this time it wasn't angry. It was energized, purposeful. Ranchers were comparing notes, sharing stories, realizing they'd all been victims of the same crime. Jim McAllister walked up to Evelyn and extended his hand. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. We all do, for how we treated you when you arrived, for doubting you, he paused, "for being blind fools." Evelyn shook his hand. "You weren't fools, you were trusting. There's a difference. Still, what you did tonight, Standing up there, facing down Mercer, proving your case, that took courage. It took anger, Evelyn corrected. Courage just meant I didn't let the anger consume me. Other ranchers came forward after that, one by one, to thank her, to apologize for their initial judgment, to ask questions about the evidence, to tell her their own stories of sales that hadn't seemed right, but they dismissed as bad luck. By the time the church finally emptied, it was past midnight. Evelyn stood in the empty building, looking at the pews where an hour ago she'd faced down the man who destroyed her family, and felt something break loose in her chest. Not relief, not quite victory, something more complicated. Caleb appeared at her elbow. "You all right?" "I don't know." "That was incredible what you did up there." "I just told the truth." "No, you made people listen to the truth. That's harder." He was quiet for a moment. "I never apologized for how I treated you at first, for dismissing what you were trying to tell me, for you don't need to apologize." "I do. You came here answering an advertisement for a wife, and I treated you like hired help. You tried to save my ranch, and I told you to stay out of my business. You saved my son's life, and He stopped, his voice going rough. "I don't have the words for what you've done for this family." Evelyn looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something different than the hard, closed-off man who'd picked her up in that wagon a month ago. This man's walls were down, his guard was dropped, and in his eyes was something that looked dangerously like admiration. "You would have figured it out eventually," she said quietly. "You're not stupid." "Maybe, but it would have been too late. The bank would have taken the ranch, the children would have lost their home, and I'd be standing in the ruins wondering where it all went wrong." He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against hers. "You didn't let that happen. You fought for us when we didn't even know we needed fighting for." "I fought for me too," Evelyn admitted. "For Thomas, for everyone Vernon Mercer destroyed back in Philadelphia. This wasn't just about your ranch." "I know, but it became about us somewhere along the way, didn't it?" She didn't have an answer for that, or maybe she did, but wasn't ready to say it out loud. They walked back to the wagon where the children were waiting, half asleep in the bed. Wyatt looked up when they approached, his expression carefully neutral. "Is it over?" he asked. "It started," Caleb said. "The marshal will come. There'll be an investigation. Mercer will either run or lawyer up. Either way, people know the truth now." "Good," Wyatt said. Then to Evelyn, "What you did in there, that was—" He paused, searching for words. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen. Coming from the boy who'd spent a month treating her like an intruder, the words meant more than Evelyn wanted to admit. "Thank you," she managed. They rode home in silence, the Montana night vast and dark around them, stars scattered across the sky, like someone had thrown diamonds at the black. And Evelyn thought about Thomas, about the courthouse steps in Philadelphia, about all the fights he'd lost because nobody would listen. Tonight, people had listened. Tonight, for the first time in 3 years, she felt like maybe her brother's death hadn't been for nothing. The wagon rolled into the ranch yard just before 1 in the morning. Caleb carried Noah inside, the boy barely stirring. Clara followed, yawning. Wyatt unhitched the horses and led them to the barn. Evelyn stood in the yard, looking at the house that had become home without her quite noticing when it happened. Caleb came back out and stood beside her. "What are you thinking?" "That I'm tired. That's all." "No." She turned to look at him. "I'm thinking that this isn't over. Mercer's not going to just accept defeat. Men like him never do." "I know. He'll fight back, try to discredit us, maybe worse." "Probably." "And you're okay with that?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, 3 weeks ago, I would have told you to leave, to take your accusation somewhere else and stop stirring up trouble. I would have chosen peace over truth because peace seemed safer. And now? Now I know peace built on lies isn't peace at all. It's just slow suffocation." He looked at her. "So yes, I'm okay with fighting as long as you're willing to fight beside me." Evelyn felt something shift in her chest, something that had been tight and guarded since Thomas died. "I'm willing," she said. They stood together in the darkness, two people who'd started as strangers and somehow become allies, watching the stars wheel overhead. And in the morning, the real war would begin. The retaliation started 3 days after the church meeting. Evelyn was hanging laundry when she heard the rider coming fast. She looked up and saw a boy she didn't recognize, maybe 14, riding hell-bent towards the house. He reined up hard in the yard, his horse breathing heavy. "Message for Caleb Ryder," he gasped. Caleb emerged from the barn, wiping grease from his hands. "I'm Ryder." The boy thrust out a folded paper. "From the land office in Helena. Man said it was urgent." Caleb took it, flipped the boy a coin, and unfolded the paper while the kid rode off. Evelyn watched his face go from curious to confused to absolutely furious in the space of 10 seconds. "What is it?" she asked. He handed her the paper without a word. It was an official notice from the Territorial Land Office. A boundary dispute had been filed regarding the eastern section of the Ryder property. The claim stated that Caleb's deed was improperly recorded and the land rightfully belonged to an entity called Mountain Cattle Holdings, LLC. A hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks from now. Failure to appear would result in forfeiture of the disputed acreage. Mountain Cattle Holdings, Evelyn read aloud. "Ever heard of them?" "No." "How much land are they claiming?" 300 acres, the best grazing land I own." Caleb's jaw was tight enough to crack stone. "This is Mercer. Has to be." "Probably, but he's hiding behind a shell company so it doesn't look like retaliation." Evelyn studied the document. "The claim says your deed was improperly recorded. When did your family file the original claim?" "My grandfather. 1851, before Montana was even a territory. Then the records would be in whatever passed for a land office back then. Probably incomplete, easy to challenge if you know how." She looked up. Mercer's brother used this exact tactic in Philadelphia. Find old claims with minor recording errors and tie them up in legal disputes until the owner goes bankrupt paying lawyers. Caleb took the paper back and stared at it like he could set it on fire through sheer force of will. "I don't have money for lawyers. I barely have money for feed." "Then we fight it ourselves." "You can't argue land law without a lawyer. Watch me." Caleb looked at her, and something in his expression shifted from anger to something that looked almost like amusement. "You're serious?" "You had evidence at the church meeting, documentation, numbers. It worked because the truth was on your side, and you presented it clearly." Evelyn gestured at the paper. "This is the same thing. Your family has owned this land for 40 years. The deed exists. We just need to prove it's legitimate. And if we can't, then we lose 300 acres and Mercer wins." She met his eyes steadily, "But I didn't come this far to let him win." The next morning, Evelyn and Caleb rode to Helena. It took most of the day, the trip brutal under a sun that seemed personally offended by their existence. By the time they reached the Territorial Land Office, Evelyn's dress was soaked through with sweat, and her lower back felt like someone had been hitting it with a hammer. The clerk at the front desk was a thin man with spectacles who looked at them like they were tracking mud into his personal home. "Help you?" he said without enthusiasm. "We need to see the original deed filing for the Ryder Ranch," Caleb said. "Black Ridge area. Filed sometime around 1851. The clerk blinked. 1851? Yes. That's 23 years ago. "I can do math," Caleb said flatly. "Records from that era are incomplete. Many were lost in the reorganization when Montana became a territory." "So you're saying you don't have it," Evelyn said. "I'm saying it may not exist anymore. Or it may exist and you just haven't looked." The clerk's expression suggested he found this conversation deeply tedious. "Ma'am, I have current filings to process. I don't have time to dig through decades of archived documents on the off chance something still exists." "We're not asking for charity," Evelyn said. "We're asking you to do your job." The clerk's face reddened. "I don't appreciate your tone. And I don't appreciate being told you can't help us when you haven't even tried." Evelyn leaned on the counter. There's a land dispute hearing in 2 weeks. If the original deed can't be found, a family loses 300 acres they've owned for 40 years. So either you help us find it, or you tell me who I need to complain to about your refusal to help. They stared at each other across the counter. The clerk broke first. Fine, he said tightly. I'll check the archives, but it'll take time. Come back tomorrow. We'll wait, Evelyn said. It could take hours. We'll wait. The clerk muttered something under his breath and disappeared into a back room. Caleb leaned against the wall and looked at Evelyn with something approaching wonder. You enjoy this, don't you? Enjoy what? Making people uncomfortable until they do what you want. I enjoy getting results. If that makes people uncomfortable, that's their problem. 4 hours later, the clerk emerged with a dust-covered ledger and a sour expression. Found it, barely. The binding was falling apart and half the pages are water damaged. He opened the ledger to a page marked with a slip of paper. The handwriting was faded and cramped, but legible. There, recorded in ink that had gone brown with age, was the original claim. Ryder James. 640 acres, Black Ridge area. Filed March 14th, 1851. Witnessed and approved. Can we get a certified copy of this page? Evelyn asked. It'll cost you. How much? $2. Done. The clerk made the copy with obvious reluctance, pressed an official seal into the paper, and handed it over like it physically pained him. Evelyn paid and walked out with the document held carefully in both hands. Outside, Caleb said, That's it? That's all we need. It's a start. Now we need to prove the eastern boundary matches what your grandfather claimed. Do you have the original survey markers? Some. Others have probably been moved or destroyed over the years. Then we'll need to find what's left and document it. Get measurements, compare them to the claim description. Evelyn looked at the certified copy. Mercer's counting on your deed being impossible to verify. We're going to prove it isn't. They rode home in the fading light, exhausted but carrying something more valuable than money. The children were waiting when they arrived. Clara had kept dinner warm. Wyatt had finished the evening chores. Even Noah had attempted to sweep the front room, though the result looked like a dirt tornado had rearranged itself slightly. Did you find it? Wyatt asked immediately. Caleb held up the certified copy. We found it. The boy's face broke into something Evelyn had never seen before, a genuine, unguarded smile. So we can fight them? We can fight them. Over the next week, Caleb and Wyatt surveyed the eastern boundary, while Evelyn organized the documentation. They found 7 of the original survey markers, iron stakes driven deep into the ground 40 years ago, still exactly where James Ryder had placed them. The measurements matched the deed description perfectly. Evelyn compiled everything into a presentation that would make a Philadelphia lawyer weep with envy. Original deed, survey records, physical evidence, witness testimony from neighboring ranchers who'd respected the boundary for decades. By the time she finished, the case was airtight. The hearing was held in a stuffy room in Helena on a Thursday morning in late August. The Territorial Land Commissioner was a tired-looking man named Douglas, who seemed like he'd rather be anywhere else. Mercer wasn't there personally. He'd sent a lawyer instead, a sharp-dressed man from back east, who introduced himself as Mr. Whitmore and carried himself like he'd already won. This is a straightforward matter, Whitmore began, his voice smooth and confident. The deed in question was improperly recorded. The claimant failed to establish clear boundaries according to territorial surveying standards of the time. As such, the land reverts to territorial holding and can be rightfully claimed by my client, Mountain Cattle Holdings. Do you have evidence of improper recording? Commissioner Douglas asked. The deed itself is evidence. It lacks the proper witness signatures required under territorial law. Evelyn stood. May I respond? Douglas looked surprised. You're not a lawyer. I'm representing the Ryder family, and I have the original deed right here. She placed the certified copy on the commissioner's desk, filed March 14th, 1851. You'll note it bears 2 witness signatures and an official approval stamp. Whitmore barely glanced at it. Those signatures can't be verified. The witnesses are likely deceased. The approval stamp is from the Territorial Land Office. That's verification enough. Stamps can be forged. Are you accusing the Territorial Land Office of fraud? Evelyn asked mildly. Whitmore's jaw tightened. I'm saying the document is suspect. Based on what evidence? Based on the fact that it conveniently appears after being missing for decades. It wasn't missing, it was archived. Your client simply didn't bother to check before filing a false claim. Evelyn pulled out another document. Here's the retrieval record from the Land Office, dated last week, signed by the clerk who found it. Would you like to accuse him of fraud as well? Commissioner Douglas was paying attention now. Do you have the survey records, Mrs. Hart? Miss Hart, and yes. She laid out the survey documentation, including photographs Caleb had taken of the iron stakes still standing along the boundary. 7 original markers remain in place exactly where the deed describes them. We have measurements, witness testimony from 3 neighboring ranches, and 40 years of continuous use and improvement of the land. Whitmore tried to rally. Markers can be moved. Not 40 years ago, they couldn't, Evelyn interrupted. These stakes were driven into ground that's been undisturbed for 4 decades. The rust patterns alone prove their age. That's speculation. It's metallurgy. Iron doesn't rust overnight, Mr. Whitmore. It takes years to develop the kind of corrosion we documented. Evelyn turned to Commissioner Douglas. Your Honor, this claim is a transparent attempt to steal land through legal manipulation. The deed is legitimate. The boundaries are verified. The Ryder family has met every possible standard of proof. Mountain Cattle Holdings, meanwhile, has provided no evidence whatsoever except vague accusations and hope that you won't look too closely. Douglas studied the documents in front of him for a long moment. Then he looked at Whitmore. Do you have any physical evidence supporting your client's claim? The burden of proof is on the defendant. The burden of proof is on whoever files a claim, Mr. Whitmore. Your client filed. Where's your evidence? Whitmore opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. We'll need time to gather additional documentation. You've had 2 weeks. If you had evidence, you'd have brought it. Douglas picked up his gavel. I'm ruling in favor of the Ryder family. The deed is legitimate. The claim is dismissed. Case closed. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that sounded like victory. Whitmore stood there for a moment, clearly trying to process what had just happened. Then he gathered his papers with movements that were a little too sharp and walked out without another word. Outside the hearing room, Caleb grabbed Evelyn's shoulders and laughed, actually laughed, a sound she'd never heard from him before. You destroyed him. I presented facts. He had none. You made a lawyer from back east look like a fool in front of a territorial commissioner. He made himself look like a fool. I just helped. Caleb pulled her into a hug, so sudden and tight it knocked the breath out of her. Thank you for everything, for fighting, for not giving up, for... You're welcome, Evelyn managed, her face pressed against his shoulder. He pulled back, looking almost embarrassed. Sorry, It's fine. They stood there for a beat, something unspoken hanging in the air between them. Then Wyatt came around the corner at a run, saw them, and skidded to a stop. We won? He asked breathlessly. We won, Caleb confirmed. Wyatt let out a whoop that echoed down the hallway and probably scandalized everyone within 50 feet. But the fight wasn't over yet. The territorial marshal came to Black Ridge 2 weeks after the land hearing. His name was Patterson, a no-nonsense man in his 50s who'd seen enough frontier justice to be skeptical of everything. He spent 3 days examining Mercer's scales, cross-referencing weight records, and interviewing ranchers. Evelyn provided him with all her documentation, walked him through the mathematical analysis, and answered every question without hesitation. On the 4th day, Patterson arrested Vern Mercer for fraud and grand theft. The news spread through the territory like wildfire in August. Mercer and Sons collapsed within a week. The brokerage's assets were frozen. Investigations were opened into Mercer's business dealings across 3 territories. And in Philadelphia, authorities started looking into Vernon Mercer's operations with renewed interest. Restitution money started flowing back to the ranchers by October. Caleb received a payment of $3,800. Not quite the full amount stolen, but close enough. He used it to pay off the bank, buy winter feed, and repair the barn roof that had been threatening to collapse for 2 years. The ranch that had been dying 6 months ago was suddenly, improbably thriving. But the biggest changes weren't financial. Wyatt stopped treating Evelyn like temporary help. He started calling her by her name instead of Miss Hart or Mom. Started asking her opinion on ranch decisions. Started acting like she was part of the family instead of someone passing through. Clara began leaving flowers on the kitchen table every morning, wildflowers she picked during her chores, arranged in a chipped vase like offerings. And Noah refused to eat Sunday breakfast unless Evelyn made the biscuits herself, claiming hers were the only ones that tasted right. But it was Caleb's changes that caught Evelyn most off guard. He started coming in for meals instead of eating alone in the barn. Started talking during dinner about his day, his plans, his worries. Started asking what she thought instead of just telling her what to do. And one evening in late October, when the first snow was threatening and the children were already in bed, he found her in the kitchen going over the updated ranch accounts. "Can we talk?" he asked. Evelyn set down her pencil. "Of course." Caleb sat down across from her, turning his hat in his hands like he was nervous. "I've been thinking about this arrangement." Her stomach dropped. "Oh, not like that. I mean," he stopped, gathered himself. "When you answered my advertisement, I was looking for help, someone to cook and clean and watch the children, a business arrangement, nothing more." "I know, but that's not what this is anymore, is it?" Evelyn wasn't sure how to answer that. She'd come west expecting exactly what he'd described. A practical arrangement, nothing romantic, just 2 people helping each other survive. But somewhere between the ledges and the fire and the land hearing, something had shifted. "No," she admitted quietly, "it's not." Caleb looked at her, and his expression was more open than she'd ever seen it. "I don't want an arrangement anymore, Evelyn. I want a real marriage, a real partnership, someone I can trust with everything, not just the household accounts. You barely knew me 4 months ago. I know you now. I know you're stubborn and fearless and smarter than half the men in this territory. I know you saved my son's life and my ranch and probably my sanity." He reached across the table and took her hand. "I know I don't deserve you, but I'm asking anyway. Will you marry me? Really marry me, not just for convenience?" Evelyn stared at their joined hands, his calloused and work-worn, hers scarred from that climb out of the ravine. 2 people who'd been broken by loss and put themselves back together through sheer refusal to quit. "Yes," she said, "but I have conditions." Caleb blinked. "Conditions? I'm not going to be decorative. I'm going to keep managing the books and arguing with lawyers and making decisions about this ranch. I wouldn't want it any other way. And I'm going to teach the children mathematics and how to spot fraud and how to fight for themselves when the world tries to take advantage. Good. And sometimes I'm going to be difficult and opinionated, and I'm not going to just agree with you because you're the man of the house." Caleb's mouth twitched into almost a smile. "Evelyn, you've been all of those things since the day you arrived. Why would I expect you to change now?" She laughed despite herself. "Fair point. So is that a yes?" "That's a yes." He stood, pulled her to her feet, and kissed her. Not tentatively or carefully, but like he meant it. Like he'd been wanting to do it for weeks and had finally worked up the courage. When they pulled apart, Evelyn was breathless and smiling, and feeling something she hadn't felt since before Thomas died. Hope. Actual, honest hope. They were married in Blackridge Church on the first Saturday in November. The same church where she'd exposed Mercer. The same room where she'd proven she was more than the soft city woman people had mocked. Half the territory showed up. Ranchers and their families filled every pew. Jim McAllister stood as Caleb's witness. Clara and Wyatt stood as Evelyn's, both wearing new clothes purchased with restitution money. Noah scattered wildflower petals down the aisle and took his job so seriously that he made everyone wait while he placed each one perfectly. Pastor Williams performed the ceremony, and when he asked if anyone objected, the room stayed silent. Not because people were being polite, but because nobody had objections. The woman who'd been a joke 4 months ago was now someone they respected, someone they trusted, someone who'd changed their entire understanding of what strength looked like. At the reception afterward, ranchers came up to thank Evelyn personally for exposing Mercer, for saving their livelihoods, for showing them that sometimes the person you need most is the one you least expect. Jim McAllister raised a toast to Evelyn Ryder, the toughest woman in Montana Territory. The room erupted in cheers. Evelyn stood beside Caleb, wearing a dress Clara had helped her sew from fabric they'd bought in Helena, and felt like maybe she'd finally found the place she was supposed to be. Not because it was easy, not because everyone had welcomed her with open arms, but because she'd fought for it, earned it, proven she belonged, not through birth or luck, but through stubborn refusal to be dismissed. The winter that followed was brutal. Montana winters always were, but the Ryder Ranch was ready for it. The barn was repaired, the feed was stocked, the books were balanced, and the family that had been fractured by loss had somehow stitched itself back together. Evelyn spent the long, dark months teaching the children, not just reading and arithmetic, but how to question authority, how to trust their own observations, how to fight for what's right, even when the world tells you to stay quiet. Wyatt turned 16 in January and announced he wanted to study law, not to be a lawyer, but to understand the system well enough to protect the ranch, to make sure nobody ever stole from his family again. Clara started keeping her own ledger, tracking household expenses with the same precision Evelyn used for ranch accounts, and Noah declared that when he grew up, he was going to be just like Miss Evie and save people from bad men. In March, a letter arrived from Philadelphia. The prosecutor handling Vernon Mercer's case wanted Evelyn to testify about Thomas's death and the fraud that caused it. The trial was scheduled for May. Caleb didn't even hesitate. "We'll go together, all of us. It's 2,000 miles. I don't care. You stood for this family, we'll stand for yours." They made the trip in April, traveling by train this time instead of stagecoach. The children had never seen a city before. They pressed their faces to the windows as Philadelphia materialized around them. Buildings taller than anything in Montana, streets crowded with more people than existed in their entire territory, noise and smoke and life moving at a speed that seemed impossible. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Evelyn testified for 2 days, walking the jury through how Vernon Mercer had systematically destroyed her family's business. She presented the same kind of evidence she'd used against his brother: numbers, patterns, documentation. Vernon Mercer was convicted on 14 counts of fraud and sentenced to 12 years in prison. When the verdict was read, Evelyn closed her eyes and thought about Thomas, about the courthouse steps where he died, about the justice he'd fought for and never received. She'd gotten it for him, finally. After the trial, they visited Thomas's grave. It was in a small cemetery on the edge of the city, the headstone simple and weather-worn. Evelyn knelt beside it and placed a handful of Montana wildflowers that Clara had insisted on bringing. "We won," she said quietly. "It took 3 years and 2,000 miles, but we won." The stone didn't answer, but she felt something settle in her chest. Something that had been tight and angry since the day she'd found him collapsed on those courthouse steps. Not peace exactly, but acceptance. The kind that comes when you finally finished a fight that needed finishing. Caleb stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder. The children waited respectfully by the gate, and Evelyn said goodbye to her brother one final time before walking back towards the family that was waiting for her. They returned to Montana in June, arriving back at the ranch just as summer was turning the hills golden. The property looked exactly the same but somehow different, like Evelyn was seeing it through new eyes. This wasn't just a place she'd ended up by accident or desperation. It was home. The first real home she'd had since Thomas died. Maybe the first real home she'd ever had, built not on obligation or circumstance, but on choice and fight and stubborn refusal to quit. The territorial newspaper ran a story about the trial, about how a woman from Montana had traveled east to testify against one of Philadelphia's most powerful businessmen and won, about how she'd exposed corruption in 2 territories and changed the way ranchers did business across the frontier. People started coming to the ranch asking for Evelyn's help. Ranchers with contract disputes, families facing foreclosure, women whose husbands had been cheated and nobody would listen. Evelyn helped them all. She reviewed their documents, found the discrepancies, taught them how to fight. She didn't charge money. She'd never been driven by wealth, but she kept a record of every case, every victory, building something larger than herself. By the fall of 1875, Evelyn Ryder had become the person ranchers across Montana Territory called when they needed someone who understood numbers and law and how to make powerful men answer for their crimes. The woman who'd stepped off a stagecoach to laughter and mockery had transformed into someone people sought out, someone they respected, someone they trusted with their livelihoods and their futures. But her proudest moments weren't the legal victories or the newspaper articles or the gratitude of strangers. They were smaller, quieter. Wyatt coming home from town and telling her about a contract a merchant tried to push on him, and how he'd caught the fraudulent clause because she taught him to read the fine print. Clara helping a neighbor family balance their books after Evelyn showed her how. Noah telling his teacher that his mother was the smartest person in Montana, and nobody better say otherwise. And Caleb late at night after the children were asleep, pulling her close and saying, "I can't imagine this place without you, can't imagine my life without you." Those were the moments that mattered, not because they were grand or dramatic, but because they were real, because they meant she'd built something that would last beyond any single fight or victory. The frontier had tried to break Evelyn's heart, tried to make her feel ashamed of who she was, tried to convince her she was too soft and too different and too much. Instead, it had forged her into steel. By the time winter settled over Black Ridge in late 1875, nobody remembered the plus-sized woman they'd laughed at stepping off that stagecoach 16 months earlier. They only remembered the woman who'd saved the mountain, who'd stood up when everyone else stayed quiet, who'd proven that strength wasn't about size or gender or where you came from, but about refusing to let the world make you small. Evelyn stood on the porch one evening in December, watching snow fall over the hills, and realized she'd stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop, stopped expecting disaster, stopped believing she didn't deserve happiness. She'd fought for it, earned it, built it with her own scarred hands, and that made all the difference. Caleb came out and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. "You'll freeze." "I'm fine. You always say that because I always am." He laughed and pulled her against him, and they stood together, watching the snow transform the landscape into something clean and new. Inside, the children were arguing about something trivial. The fire was crackling. Dinner was keeping warm on the stove. The ledges were balanced. The ranch was thriving. Life wasn't perfect. It never would be. There would be more fights, more struggles, more moments when everything felt impossible. But Evelyn had learned something important in those 16 months since leaving Philadelphia. You don't need a perfect life. You just need the courage to fight for a real one. And she had that courage in abundance. She always had. The world had just needed to catch up.